Welcome to the History Quill podcast, all about writing and publishing historical fiction, brought to you by the History Quill, the home of historical fiction writers.
I am historical fiction author Julia Kelly, and I'm joined by my co-host Theodora Brun. This is another really exciting episode of the History Quill podcast. But first, Theo, how are you?
I'm doing so-so, I would say. I've been a little under the weather in the last week, but I'm kind of coming back fighting just about, even if I look a little bit pale today. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm also sort of hiding in my writing cave, so not too much to report, unfortunately. But I hope you're feeling better soon.
Yeah, well, writing is happening, so that's good. And the only thing I shall report is that I did have some input from my agent yesterday, who said that what I sent her was good, which is always a relief.
A bit of a boost.
Yes, it was definitely a boost, because it was one of those, I'm writing this ghostwriting novel, which I'm not 100% sure. Well, until she came back anyway, I was like, is this working or not? And I mean, I'm always a bit lacking in confidence when it comes to a first draft, so it was nice to get something positive.
Well, we have got a really action-packed episode for you today, a really great conversation with historical fiction author Hazel Gaynor. So I think we will jump right into that.
Excellent. Let's get into the conversation.
We are really thrilled to give a very big welcome to my friend and very, very talented historical author, Hazel Gaynor. Hazel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
We'd love to hear a little bit about you and your books, just to kick us off and orient readers who may be hearing about your work for the first time.
Oh, a potted history of Hazel Gaynor. The pressure when you're asked to talk about yourself. So the short version is that I write historical novels, mostly set in the 20th century, mostly inspired by real events. I've written about everything from my debut novel focused on the Titanic. That was called The Girl Who Came Home. And that was 10 books ago, unbelievably, which makes me sound old and wise, but I'm not sure I'm certainly not the latter. And my latest book, The Last Lifeboat, is a story set in the Second World War. And I guess what I've always tried to do with all of my novels, even if the premise is something very familiar for readers, is to dig into that piece of history and find a lesser known or an unknown part of that piece of history, to find a voice that maybe hasn't been written about as often. And I do always try to write from a female point of view, to find stories particularly of very ordinary women who found themselves in these exceptional circumstances, and how they found strength within themselves to overcome adversity. And I've just been so fascinated by the stories and the people I've discovered in my research. So that's my sort of little whirlwind version of what I write. And as I say, I've been writing for just over 10 years now. I live in Ireland, originally from Yorkshire. Very proud Yorkshire lass.
East Riding.
East Riding of Yorkshire.
So my mother-in-law lives up there. Yeah.
It's the best bit of Yorkshire. So I'm kind of a hybrid.
My wife always says that.
I'm Yorkshire Irish at this stage, because I also got my Irish citizenship a couple of years ago. So I'm very proud to have my Irish passport. So yeah, I'm a bit of a mixed bag. And I suppose I pull into all of that in terms of where I find my stories. So I've pulled some from Yorkshire. I've pulled some from British history. I do try to weave Ireland in there when I can. So yeah, I just find this job endlessly fascinating, as I'm sure we all do.
It's very interesting looking at the list of the books that you've read and the variety in terms of the different stories that you tell, which I'd love to ask you about a little bit later. But actually, as you were talking just then, you characterize what do they have in common, these ordinary women who are sort of confronted with something in terms of adversity, and how do they get through that? How do they overcome and find their way forward? And I thought it made me think actually of how you got into writing, which I didn't know whether you could unpack a little bit more, because I know that your background was in the law, at least for a little while, wasn't it? And things went a bit awry in 2008. You hit this kind of wall of adversity, and then you pivoted and did something else with your life. So, and then there was actually a few years, was it 3 or 4 years before you published your first novel? So I don't know if it's useful for our readers to kind of hear how you went from, what seemed like a massive setback to actually turning that into opportunity, into the career that you've now had.
Yeah. And I often, describe myself as somebody who has certainly not followed a conventional path to being a published author. And I think for some people that's good to hear, that there isn't one way to do this. I've certainly gone about things in a very strange way, but it's all worked out. So my background was working in professional services firms. So my day was very much the corporate commute, suited and booted. I lived and worked in London, big, corporate office buildings. And then when I moved to Ireland, I continued that for a little while. And it's interesting because through all of that, I was always the one who wanted to do any bits of creative writing within those jobs. So if there was a piece of communication, if there was a staff newsletter, anything in a team away day, I would always put my hand up and do that. I've always loved story. And I suppose the short way of explaining all of that is I think I was always in the wrong job. I had a very successful career, and I never expected to have this second amazing life writing for a living. I didn't know how you became a writer. I didn't know any authors. I didn't have any access to anybody in this industry. And I know a lot of writers have lovely stories of when they were little and they always dreamt of being a writer. I was a reader. I absolutely loved reading. I read from being a very young age. I could read before I went to school. We went to the library all the time. My mum was hugely inspirational in taking me and my sister to fill the house with books. So when I got to a point, as you said, in the sort of, mid 2000s, the Celtic tiger stopped roaring. And as many people did, I found myself in a situation where the career that I'd had and assumed I could have forever wasn't there anymore. But I also had 2 young children. So I kind of had I've always said, looking back, it was a real silver lining. Suddenly I was confronted with, who are you? And what are you going to do with the rest of your life now that this career has gone away? And what I did, which I think is fascinating, is I wrote about that transition. So I started to write about how it felt moving from literally the boardroom to the kitchen, and having 2 little tots running around. And how did I feel about that? And I started a blog. Blogging was all very cool and new at the time. Social media was like this big new way of accessing people's lives and stories. I started a blog called, and I'm still very proud of this name, Hot Cross Mom. And it was really cathartic. It was like me somehow exercising this shift in my life. And through that blog, I started to write for local newspapers, had a little column, started to write for features for magazines about being what was called at the time a stay-at-home mom. Funny how language changes, and that, we wouldn't sort of talk about a woman like that now. But it gave me a way of finding my voice. And that then led to me doing something I had said for years, was I was going to write a book one day. I didn't know what that book was going to be. Turns out it was about the Titanic. So, if you're going to go somewhere, start big. And I instantly knew I was doing what I'd been meant to do the whole time. I honestly can't tell you how right this feels. And I was rejected for 5 years through submissions to agents, publishers. And every time I got a knockback, it just made me more determined. As I mentioned, I'm a Yorkshire lass. There's something in there about being stubborn.
7 stages of nay. My wife talks about that. Is that a Yorkshire thing? I think it must be.
Absolutely. And eventually I self-published that first novel, The Girl Who Came Home. I had finished it about 6 months before 2012, which was the centenary of the Titanic sinking. Suddenly Titanic was everywhere again. And it was really a decision I remember saying to my husband, if I publish this on Kindle, I might get 100 readers. And that's better than it sitting on my laptop, tormenting me. And within a year, it had 100,000 downloads. And I had written another novel. I got an agent in the States. A couple of years after that, I got a publishing deal with HarperCollins. I mean, it sounds like the dream happened. But I feel like I really put in the graft and my apprenticeship to test whether I had what it takes to keep going. Persistence, I think, is often what writers need as much as a creative mind. But once I got that yes, it sort of all, it was like dominoes, just everything kept falling into place. But yeah, I took a very sort of circuitous route to get there. And now I have wonderful friends, a community of writers that I can talk to, that I can turn to. And I love offering advice to aspiring writers because I didn't have it. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know who to ask. So I love talking about that journey and sharing the slightly strange process that I took, but we got there in the end.
One of the reasons I love talking to you is because you're fantastic at putting into words kind of the experience of being an author and what it is like to try to do this work day after day. One of the things that struck me in your both description of your books and also your description of your career is that idea of finding your voice, but also bringing to light these elements of history that maybe haven't been talked about before or are more or less forgotten by the public. I'm thinking of a couple of your books in particular. So you can go with this wherever you want to go with it. But can you give us some examples of where you go and how you start the process of looking for that? Because I imagine looking for lesser known elements of history is in and of itself a challenge because they're lesser known. So you won't necessarily know they're out there. What is the discovery process like for you?
Well, it's a great question. And, it's something that I think anyone who's writing is always interested in idea. Where does idea come from? I'm actually just at the minute rereading Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic, about the creative life. And she talks about this sense of idea and the ideas are all around us all the time. And it's about being tuned in as a creative person, whether that's a piece of art, whether it's a short story, whether it's a novel, and that some ideas will pass you by because you literally aren't tuned in and ignore them. And we've all had that moment, I guess, where somebody announces a book and you're like, that was my idea. I was going to write that next, but somebody got there first. And I love that. I love that sense that there are ideas that are for us and there are ideas that are not for us. And it's about, I guess, paying attention. And sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes it can take years to find the way to write a story. And that has been true with me. So, for example, starting out writing The Girl Who Came Home, I've been fascinated by Titanic since I was a teenager when the wreck was discovered. So that was in me, that story, that piece of history was always there. But it wasn't until I lived in Ireland and got to that point in my life where I was looking at what do I do next, that I read about a group of women, children and men who left Ireland on Titanic and had this incredible story connected to them. And that was my version of that story that hadn't been told before. And then I've had things from my childhood. So my fourth novel I'm forgetting.
You lose count at some point.
There are a few.
There's been too many.
There's quite a few.
So the lighthouse keeper's daughter was inspired by Grace Darling, who, again, I read about and learned about as a primary school student. This incredible woman. I always felt she was like Florence Nightingale, but nobody knew about her, who lived in a lighthouse up on the Farne Islands off the coast of Northumberland, saved survivors of a shipwreck, had this incredible story that hasn't been as talked about as, for example, Florence Nightingale. And she's always been with me as well. Similarly, The Cottingley Secret. There I go back to Yorkshire, finding a story of two young girls talking about finding fairies at the bottom of the garden. And that was that story. So there's been that. And then taking us up to my most recent book with The Last Lifeboat, it was sort of a more curated find, if you like. I wanted to write about evacuees in the Second World War. And that research process led me to this story I'd never heard of children sent away by sea. So sent overseas, away from Britain, not to the countryside, which was the evacuee story I knew. And within that, I read an account of this incredible woman called Mary Cornish, who ended up in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic with several children who were under her care that she was escorting to Canada from Liverpool, and how she kept them safe and helped them through this ordeal of being lost at sea for a period of time. And her story was what led me to create my character of Alice in The Last Lifeboat. So sometimes it has been, I think, idea that has been with me, and other times I've gone looking. And sometimes I look and I find something that isn't meant for me. And sometimes you're lucky and you find that little bit of gold that then you grab hold of.
It's so fascinating hearing you talk about that. Can I ask you to talk about one book that had real personal resonance for me, just because of ideas that are coming to me about it, one of the next books I want to write. But it seemed a little out of, your domain of sort of Ireland, Britain, the 20th century, and Yorkshire, which was The Bird in a Bamboo Cage, and this experience of this lesser known theatre of operations, let's call it, of the Second World War in China, and the expat experience in China. Can you just talk a little bit about where that idea came from? Because that interested me, that how two things align when you're thinking about them, and then suddenly the idea's there in front of you as well.
There's your big magic. This is what I love
exactly.
about
That is a classic example.
Yeah. And this is why, I think people say, write what you know, or I never ascribe to that. I always want to write what I want to know more about. And that was the case with The Bird in the Bamboo Cage. And again, this was an idea that was literally sent to me. My agent sent me a link to an NPR podcast recording, which was two people talking about Girl Scout cookies. In America, they have Girl Scout cookies season where the girl guides go around selling cookies. And one of these people went selling cookies, long story short, ended up meeting this incredible woman who had been interned in China as an expat in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And what had helped her get through that ordeal was being part of a group of brownie guides and girl guides. And I listened to this, and my agent sort of sent it to me and said, just leaving this with you, do with it what you will. And I was like, what is this story? I had goosebumps, and I just replied to her and I said, I'm writing this book. It's astonishing. And I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified because I knew nothing about the war in the Pacific. I've never been to China. I didn't know anything about that part of the world, let alone that part of the world in the 1940s. But research is a wonderful thing. And again, found these incredible women who had taken this group of school children and kept them safe through 4 years under Japanese guard. And the resilience and the things they endured collectively and individually just had to be written. And again, this massive event that we know about, the Second World War, and yet here was a part of it that I feel we don't hear about as much, the war in the Pacific. And what people endured there was very different to what we know about through the war in Europe. And again, as I say, it really frightened me. So if you're feeling frightened, Theodore, then I totally understand because it's a lot. There's a lot of history in there. But I think you've just got to trust yourself. And I think that comes with experience. I don't know if I could have written that book 10 years ago. And that's what I mean about ideas sometimes taking time. I've just finished writing a book literally yesterday.
Congratulations.
Deadline face. Thank you. That again, I don't think I could have written 10 years ago. So you certainly learn, I think, the confidence in yourself that it isn't always perfect the first time, far from it. But you learn to work through the process, through rounds of edits, and be okay that it's not perfect the first time. And I think that's why a lot of ideas and books are abandoned, because it isn't what's up here. And you think, therefore, oh, okay, this isn't what I wanted it to be. I'll just do something else. But it's the job, isn't it? It's the work that creates what we hope will be close to what was up here. I'm not sure it ever quite gets to the ideal. If it does, then I'm very envious, but it can get close. So that was an idea that literally, again, was given to me, and I could have done, I suppose, several things with that. But yeah, that's why it feels different. And I loved that writing process. I loved the challenge of stepping out of my comfort zone. And that's then led me to The Last Lifeboat, because I felt I wanted to explore the Second World War more, but again, in a different way. So we ended up in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. So that was a very different situation to write about, very claustrophobic. Whereas The Bird in the Bamboo Cage was very epic and sweeping and, 4 years. This is The Last Lifeboat's 8 days. So it's a very different feeling as a writer.
You talk about sort of those ideas that are for you and ideas that aren't for you. I also heard that NPR story, and I remember thinking to myself, that's a really great story. Somebody's going to write a really great book about that.
Really?
It just completely didn't occur to me that that person could be me, because I don't think at the time I was the right person to write that book. And I'm so glad that you did, because it's an absolutely fantastic novel. So there you go.
Wow,
it's just,
thank you. That's amazing.
Proof that these things happen in real time.
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure and ask you a little bit, because one of the things that I've seen throughout your books is playing with narrative structure a little bit, whether it's through dual timelines or multiple POVs. Can you talk a little bit about why certain books you feel should be told for you in that way, and how you go about figuring out what a book needs when it comes to a multiple POV or a dual timeline, which kind of in and of itself is always a multiple POV, right?
Yeah. And again, I was so wonderfully naive when I started, and I sometimes miss that naivety. I didn't think about, should I write this story of the Titanic in first person, third person, dual timelines, linear. I didn't know any of those terms. I didn't even know I was writing historical fiction. I didn't know enough about the industry to know those frameworks, if you like. I just wrote my story, and I try to remember that every time I sit down. Even now, whatever the industry needs this to be packaged as, whatever way it will be interrogated in terms of its narrative structure, I need to tell this story. And I do try to remember that now. So there was an innocence about my first 3 books were dual timeline. And maybe it was a little bit about feeling it fit the story, but me also finding my way as a writer. and finding my way into writing history. And maybe there's a little bit of comfort in pulling back from that history every other chapter or a few chapters at a time and sort of coming back to closer to now. I've never written contemporary as in this time, but it's been 2 periods of history. And maybe that's thinking about it now, maybe, as I say, just a little bit of comfort in having 2 strands that you can add to. It's very daunting to write in a linear way that this whole story has to happen over the 90 or 100,000 words. But certainly with my first 2 books, The Girl Who Came Home and A Memory of Violets, it was about a sense of mystery that had been woven between generations. And I think that really suits a dual timeline, dual narrative, to sort of that weaving back and forth between one character and another. And the reader knows they're connected in some way, but maybe doesn't know how. I did it again with the Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, bringing in narrative forms like diaries or letters. And I think historical fiction's brilliant for that, because obviously everybody communicated in the written way. And that's a piece of history our characters can work with. But I do think if anyone writes in a dual timeline, both parts have to serve the story. So you can't just throw in a second or third timeline or character to pad out the story. And I think we've all probably read multi-narrated or dual timeline novels where we just can't wait to get back to the other bit. You know, and you're sort of sad when you turn the page, you're like, oh no, she's taking us back there. I don't want it. And you're sort of skipping forward. So I think both parts have to work. They have to kind of, dovetail really well. And you do have to plan that out, I think, quite carefully in terms of where does one part stop and the next part pick up again. I've never written them in any way other than the reader reads the book. So I know some writers with dual timelines, they'll write one, then they'll write the other, then they'll figure out how to weave them together. I've never done that. I write as you read. So I'll go from then to now to then to now. And that just works for me. But it can be a wonderful way of bringing in light and shade. If the story is very heavy, you can bring in a sort of lighter thread. If your reader needs a little bit of a breather, it's great for weaving in mystery, generational stories. Actually, The Cottingley Secret, I did that as well. So we move between 1917 and the fairies, and then a contemporary bookshop in Ireland where this story is now unfolding again. And there's something lovely about that as a writing and reading process. And then with The Last Lifeboat, I didn't do that at all, which was a totally different writing experience. But I do, I think the main thing is that both parts have to work hard. You can't sort of rely on one to do the heavy lifting and just throw another one in, because it's irritating to read that.
Can I ask you, talking of different ways of writing, choosing how to write books, you've obviously done several books now, I think, with Heather Webb co-authoring. Is it 4 that you're about to publish? The 4th?
4th that's the next deadline.
The 4th is coming. That just seems totally
crazy,
alien
right?
to me.
Yeah.
I just don't know how that would work. Can you just talk a bit about A, how that came about, and B, how does it work from idea to execution?
Yeah, I mean, great idea. Have one author in Ireland, one in New England in America, and write books together. What could possibly go wrong? It's amazing. And the fact that we're just about to publish a 4th is testament to that. So Heather and I have the same agent. And again, isn't it amazing how life brings you in various ways? So when I finally secured an agent back in 2013, a wonderful lady called Michelle Brower, who's now with Trellis, her own agency, she also represented Heather. And she connected us and said, look, you two are both writing historicals. You've got debuts. We could all do with a friend, right? So, chat, hang out. And we just got on. So we supported each other, cheerleading on social media when our books came out. And Heather then sent me an email and said, I'm thinking of creating an anthology, getting 9 authors together to write about the armistice, the end of the First World War. Are you interested? And I was like, yeah. I'd never written about the First World War, terrified me, but I was eager to do whatever I could to, expand my career. So I said, yeah. And we wrote a book together with 7 other authors called Fall of Poppies, went to the States on tour, met Heather, fell in love with her as a dear friend. And shortly after that book came out, I messaged her and said, do you want to do another anthology? And she said, no, never again. It was just too difficult to wrangle 9 authors together.
It's a lot.
in a book. It's a lot. She said, but I would write a book with you. And what we decided to do was write a novel that expanded on all the research we'd done for Fall of Poppies, set in the First World War, told between 2 characters, a guy and a girl, but written in letters. So an epistolary novel written in an exchange of correspondence between character A, character B, Tom and Evie. One of us wrote each. And it was amazing. We literally wrote letters to each other as our characters through the 4 years, the 4 Christmases of the First World War. And that became Last Christmas in Paris. And we had such a riot writing that together. We said, should we do it again? And we did. We work on Google Docs. So it's sort of a live document that we can write in. The time difference is really helpful because by the time I've got up and written, I can then, tag you or it, and Heather picks up when she's up and about in the States. And then I get up the next morning and there's stuff added from her. And talking about dual narrative, dual point of view, that's exactly how we've done it. So we've always written together books that revolve around two main characters, and we write one each, but we write every single page together ultimately through the editing process. And we've just said, as long as we're enjoying this, we'll keep doing it. There's no pressure. There's no obligation. If we come up with an idea and we're both excited, we'll pitch it. And if our editor wants it, we'll write it. And so far, so good. It's been amazing. And it has also been really helpful to each of our individual writing as well, which is an unexpected bonus. My book wife, as I call her.
Could you talk a little bit more about how it's been helpful to you for your individual careers? Because I think people might think, okay, co-written book, it's something completely different. It's a completely different process.
Yeah. And it is a different process because you've got to let go, and we all hold on to our books, write the first draft with the door closed, right? As Mr. King advises us, but this, you have to let go of that from the beginning. There cannot be any ego. You've got to be you're being edited all the time, essentially, by your co-writer. And I guess what it's given us both is it's a side project. It's that sense of always creating. And it can also be a little breather. So when you're working on your own book and you get down a plot snag or you just run out of energy, but you still want to work, you still want to write, you can jump into this other project. And it's that, it sounds like a cliche, but it's like anything, isn't it? The more you do it, the better you get at it. And I don't know how you both work, but I find it really hard to not be writing. So even when I've delivered a book yesterday, for example, I'm now thinking what I need to get back to the next one. And what a co-written book allows us to do, which is often running concurrently with our own work, is to keep your training gear on and go out for another run, sort of thing.
Is it quicker?
I'd like to say yes.
Maybe when you're in it, you say yes, but
it doesn't feel like it. Do you know what it is, though? It's really great if you get to a point in it and you're like, oh, I'm exhausted. And it's like, right, your turn. You fill in the next bit. I think it helps in terms of maybe considering things in a slightly different way. You know, Heather's funny. We write and I'll write this lovely, I think I write naturally quite poetically. But she always says to me, you know, that's really lovely, but something has to happen. So she's the little voice on my shoulder saying something has to happen. There has to be tension. So I've learned that now when I'm writing on my own. I've got Heather on my shoulder saying, beautiful prose, Hazel, but what happens? And, you know, and she's equally learned similar things from me. So, you know, as I say, we wouldn't do it if it wasn't enjoyable. It's not easy. And you certainly couldn't just say to any of your mates, should we write a book together? We have become friends through the process, but it started off in a very, I suppose, organic way. It's not like I have lots of very dear writing friends, and I've said to them, I love you very much, but I am never writing a book with you because you would drive me mad and our brains don't work the same way. Heather and I have a synergy. We don't write in exactly the same way, but we complement each other. And it works. But I've heard of a lot of people trying to co-write and it hasn't worked. So I'd approach with caution, I think is my advice. When it works, it's a wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
Julia, are you up for it? Do you want to?
I was going to say we should have a World War II Middle Ages mashup thing. Yeah, you never know. Maybe we'll meet somewhere in the middle. Exactly.
Dual timeline. We'll somehow figure it out.
Come on, guys, it's just waiting to happen.
It's funny you mentioned though, because I have chatted with a couple of, and I do have one writing friend I think I could potentially write with, because I do think our brains are similar and our process is similar. But it's one of the reasons that I love talking to authors, because sometimes I sit there and I think we just approach this completely differently, and it's fascinating. But I don't know if I could necessarily make my process work in a way that would work for that person and vice versa. So it's wonderful that you two have figured out what works for both of you and how that, you know, also has a positive benefit for your individual careers.
Yeah. And it's been, and again, you know, it's not like either of us ever sat down with this big grand plan. You know, 5 years from now, I'd like to be co-writing books with an author who lives on the other side of the world. But I suppose it goes back to the ideas, you know, scenario of being open to things, and if opportunity knocks, what do you do about that? And it's just been a wonderful addition to this crazy job that we all do. And, you know, as I say, it wouldn't necessarily work for everyone. But it's great fun, and we're enjoying it. But I am dreading going back to edits.
Next naturally. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Before we go, we want to make sure that people can find you and follow along with your career, 10 books and growing. So where can people look for you online? And maybe if you want to plug what's recently come out as well.
Well, I'm always procrastinating on Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days. So I'm very straightforward. I'm at Hazel Gaynor on most platforms. hazelgaynor.com is my website, which as I'm saying it, I'm thinking needs to be updated. And I have a newsletter as well. So I try and do a newsletter about once a month to share what's coming up, cover reveals, giveaways, what I've been reading. And I don't, you know, do more than, if I do one a month, I'm doing well. So I certainly don't fill up your inbox too much. And I have an exciting new release of The Last Lifeboat coming out in paperback in April. So this lovely story that's taken me on an incredible journey so far is coming back with a new look in April. And we also recently just heard that my incredible narrator, Billy Fulford Brown, has been shortlisted for an Audies Award and is going over to LA for the ceremony in March. So she's up for Best Fiction Narrator, and she did such an amazing job of dramatizing The Last Lifeboat. So I'm so thrilled for her and for the book. So there's lots lots coming up. So exciting times.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us and talking us through all of this. It's been wonderfully inspiring and insightful all the way through.
Thank you. And I look forward to you two and your collaboration on a novel set in the War in the Pacific, was it?
Yes.
Thank you, Hazel.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Hazel. Well, that was a fantastic conversation with Hazel Gaynor. I loved that. So many great points, as always, to dissect there. But first, a little housekeeping.
Of course. So before we dive in, I want to make sure that I let all of our listeners know about a special bonus episode for the podcast, which is available exclusively to our email subscribers. The episode is about how to succeed in historical fiction, and we're joined by two very accomplished historical fiction authors, Jill Paul and David Penny. They share all of the ingredients to their success with us. And they also talk to us a little bit about how you can succeed in the genre as well. To get that episode, go to thehistoryquill.com/bonus. You can find the link in the description or enter it into your browser.
That's right. And there's so much great advice in that episode. So do go ahead and try and find it. Right. So Hazel Gaynor, where should we start, Julia?
So I love talking to Hazel because whenever I do, whether it's for a recorded interview that's, publicly available or just chatting away over lunch or something like that, I feel like she has wonderful insights into sort of what it is to be an author, what it is to be a professional author. And then she's also really thoughtful about the craft of writing as well. So I think maybe, if you don't mind, maybe let's start with sort of her ideas about finding the right story and having that story be the right thing for you to write as an author. Have you run into those situations before where you've thought, this is great, this is wonderful, I'm not at the place in my career where I can write this, or alternatively, this is absolutely the right story for me, and you just have that gut instinct, known reaction that this is for you?
I think that, there are always ideas coming, aren't there? And some of them really stick as something close to your heart that seems to have been served up for you. I think that was the point that seemed to really strike you in particular, especially in the negative, almost like that you came across an idea and you're like, that's not for me. I can see it's a good idea. To put some flesh on the bones, the question, the reason I saw this kind of connection with her story set in China was, I think, because it's January, it's the start of the year. I'd been reflecting on what is a story that I want to tell that kind of really, I'd look back and go, that was a story worth telling. And I think the backstory to this is coming to a bit of a crossroads in the stuff that I've been writing so far, which is I'm not sure it's going to go forward with the publisher that I'm with in terms of just a continuation of the series that I've been writing. So I was like, what are the kind of stories that really has stayed with me? And one of them is not actually a novel, but it's a movie, Chariots of Fire. And it's always come back to me again and again through my life. When I was a kid, I was tried to be an athlete. So I was interested in it then, and it sort of came back another time and another time. And I was listening to the soundtrack over the weekend and suddenly started having this idea, because I don't know if those who may have seen the movie, or it's connected with one of the guys in it, it's Eric Liddell, who ends up, although he's connected with the Olympics, which is the main part of the story, he goes on to be a missionary in China, and he ends up dying in an internment camp. Japanese internment camp. And it was not the same story that she told, but there was a sort of similarity. It's more of a male story between two brothers, and it's fictionalized and what have you. Anyway, started coming up as an idea. And I think a lot of things came together where I was like, wow, I'm at a point where I'm going to start pitching to my editor for some new ideas. This has suddenly blown all the others out of the water in terms of the story I want to tell. And it's like a sort of Cain and Abel story between two brothers in that setting. And there's something about it that really kind of gets into your heart, that although you have other ideas, there are ones that you just suddenly want to get going and start telling and start researching. And I think that's probably the best way I can answer that question is the actual practical outworking of what that feels like. So we'll see whether it has traction in terms of editorial interest from a publisher, but certainly as the author, you get the hooks of a story get into you, and hopefully this won't let me go. How about for you?
Well, first of all, great movie, and just recently showed that to my husband for the first time. It's fantastic, stands up on rewatch, absolutely. In terms of it's interesting having this conversation now, because I am at a bit of a I don't know if it's a pivot point, I think is a bit too strong, but I am thinking about what a book that I already have a contract for will be. It's the second book on a contract, and I'm trying to formulate a pitch, and I've been playing around with ideas that it's almost like they're almost within reach, but I haven't quite been able to pin them down. And I think that might be a sign. And I've been sort of, I made a note or two while I was listening to Hazel speak. I think that what started this idea and what started these topics, maybe it's not quite the right time for me to write about those books, but there is the nugget of something that has come up. And I don't want to say too much, because again, this is very much in the beginning stages of even conceptualizing a pitch. There is something there. I know there's something there. And I think that maybe that's where I need to go off, and I need to do a bunch of reading, and I need to do a bunch of thinking, and just start to figure out what that pitch looks like. And knowing that maybe the idea that initially brought me to this subject, maybe that's for a couple of books from now, but there is something really valuable to be had in the moment. So I think there's a lot of value to sort of exploring the world and exploring the research and diving down some research rabbit holes and seeing where it brings you. And then also figuring out, what is it about the idea that is really pulling you in? What's the hook? What's the thing that is making you excited, and sort of focusing on that? Because sometimes research can feel so broad and so big, it's hard to get your arms around it when you're starting to narrow it down to an actual book idea. So I think for me, that was part of what was wonderful about talking with her, is it sort of reminded me that, I can always go back. I can write books that maybe I wasn't ready to write 2 or 3 books ago because they needed time to percolate, or I needed time to grow as an author.
Yeah, that was an interesting point as well. The idea of feeling a little trepidation in terms of, can you actually pull this one off? And maybe that's always stretching out. That horizon is always just stretching a little further ahead of you, even though, as she said, she was writing books now that she definitely couldn't have written 8 years ago or 10 years ago when she started out. And that's always, I suppose, it's getting comfortable with that feeling of a little bit of fear, because it's slightly the unknown. But you've been in that, you've got to remind yourself that you've been in that place before, haven't you? Where
yes,
even right at the beginning, it's like, how do you write a novel? How do you write anything? A chapter.
I have that feeling every time I start a book. I know I've done this before, but I have no idea how I did it. And that's frightening. It's the question of, can I do it again? Right.
Yeah. There was a brilliant meme I saw recently on social media. It was called something like author's anxiety or writer's anxiety. And it was like, I'm anxious because everyone's reading my review, everyone's writing reviews about me. I'm anxious because no one's writing reviews about my book. I was like, I'm anxious because I haven't yet delivered my manuscript to my editor. I'm now anxious because I have delivered my manuscript to my editor. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's basically, you could be anxious about everything in the writing world. So maybe it's better to just be anxious about not too much, or at least just get used to that feeling that there's always something to worry about. Get comfortable
with the idea that you're always going to be worried about something. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But she certainly, it was nice, notwithstanding that, to hear her describe that sort of slotting into a kind of mode of being, if you like, that she always didn't know that was always there for her, but actually now she's in it. This was what she was supposed to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great reminder that not everybody comes to writing in a straightforward path. Different people have different ways of getting here, and different people are at different places in their writing journey, whether that's a career or a hobby or whatever it is that ultimately you want out of it. I think that's a great reminder that it's not always straightforward.
What about the co-authoring side? I know we joked about us co-authoring.
You never know. Maybe it will happen.
Yeah, it could come to that. What do you think about that? Like, do you find it tempting, or it's never occurred to me after me?
Yeah, I do find it tempting. And again, I think part of what's important for me would be finding the right person with the right approach to it. I think everybody's writing process is very personal and very individual. And so it's one of the reasons that I think it's nearly impossible to replicate somebody's writing process, because ultimately it may not be, elements of it might work for you, but it may not be for you, full stop. I think for me, a lot of it has to do with balancing the right idea, the right co-author, the right approach to working. And I think you don't know what that is until you start to actually do the work together, right? But I think my impression of it is you have to go in with a really strong idea that, this is a professional relationship, can be a friendship as well, but ultimately you're trying to produce something that you're then going to presumably try to sell, if that's what the end goal is, to have it published. And so I think everybody needs to be on the same page. But I've talked to both Hazel and Heather before, and I think that their partnership seems, uniquely to work uniquely well. And I think it's exciting to see, because clearly they get so much out of it on both sides, as co-authors, but also as individual authors as well. I thought that was really interesting, hearing about how much it's helped her with her own books.
Yeah, it sounds like you can make it a little bit easier by structuring the book in such a way, like they were talking about two point of views. I can sort of see how that would work, because then you have more ownership over one voice and not so worried about the other one, or more objectively, evaluating the other one on just to help the other person. But
have you been tempted by the idea of co-authoring? Outside, of course, of this co-authoring idea that's happening live on this podcast right now.
Yeah, exactly. I still think that dual timeline would be interesting. Someone discovering some archaeological discovery during the Second World War,
exactly,
that was connected back to the medieval times. Now I think about it, I kind of am I'm involved in this to some extent with my ghostwriting hat on. I think I mentioned to you before this. I've got a contract to write a kind of kids fantasy adventure. I mean, like it's not Harry Potter, but it's like it in the sense that it's set in the real world, but there's kind of fantasy magic interrupting into our world, as it were. So it's not like high fantasy, completely different world building. It's set in London, let's say, and mostly, I mean, the original idea didn't come from me. But all the plot so far has come from me in terms of getting a synopsis. And then I've written the first probably 20,000 words, just me writing it. But it's going to be this iterative process with not just one other, the purported author, but their like creative team. So I don't know how that's going to go.
But it has this sort of collaborative approach to it.
Yeah, there's a collaborative
different
approach, and I've got to listen to their input, and some of their input is definitely useful. Others, the whatever expertise we bring in terms of story structure and like how basically you have to kind of keep the hooks coming in for that kind of a book, maybe is more in my court. But yeah, it's different. I've got to open my mind and accept that they've got a load of ideas that they're going to want to see. Ultimately, it's going to be their name on the cover, so they've got to be happy. So we'll see. I'll keep you posted.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating process.
Yeah, I think it's very different, though, to the idea of like two co-authors who are both historical writers. Let's do one together. It's slightly different to that. Well, lots to think about from Hazel's inputs. So hopefully we can put some of that into practice.
Absolutely. Thank you again to our guest, Hazel Gaynor, for a brilliant conversation. That unfortunately concludes this episode of the History Quill podcast. But before we go, I wanted to remind you to head over to thehistoryquill.com/bonus to get our bonus episode on how to succeed in historical fiction. Again, that features guest authors Jill Paul and David Penny. It's really essential listening for any historical fiction writer, so make sure to check it out. And you can find the link in the description or by entering it into your browser.
And of course, wherever you're listening to this podcast, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave us a comment or a review. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next time.